author, master storyteller, and creator of worlds. Furthermore, he has helped bridge the gap between literature and television through all of his work as an executive producer and helping with short film adaptations of the late, great Howard Waldrop stories. Fans, please welcome George R.R. Martin.
Yay. Yay. Hi there. Hello. Thank you. Thank you for coming again here. We have a treat for you here, I hope, but it has nothing to do with Westeros or really most of my other work. It has to do with the work of one of my oldest and closest friends who died sadly in January of 2024. Howard Waldrop. Howard and I, some of you have been to the other panels and speeches and stuff I've done here, and you kind of know that I'm an old comic book geek. And I was actually the first person to sign up for the New York City Comic-Con in 1964. Comic fandom was just starting. Hadn't had any comic conventions yet. Science fiction conventions went back to the 1930s. And science fiction fandom went to the 30s. And science fiction fans like comics too. So there were always a few panels and fanzines. But it was just like a subset of science fiction fandom. It wasn't until '64, comic fandom had started to branch off. There were comic book fanzines. There's a lot of young people here. I don't know. How does it, the fanzines are an amateur fan magazine. It makes no money, and it pays nothing for the stories. It was amateur stories, amateur essays, amateur artwork, all of that stuff from us comic book fans and science fiction fans before us. But we were just getting going here, and someone had the bright idea of having a comic book convention, just comic books, no other books, just comic books. And they scheduled it for, I think it was like a union hall down in Greenwich Village for one day, and like 30 people came. And they announced it in one of the fanzines, and I lived in Bayonne, New Jersey, and this was going to be in New York, so it was close enough for me to go to it. So it was expensive. I had to scrape up $1.50, and I mailed it in. I was the first person to get it in. So when they actually had the convention, I was like number one. Not that I did anything except attend and enjoy it, Howard was a young writer. He was a couple years older than me. I was young once, and he was only slightly older. And he lived in Arlington, Texas, and I lived in Bayonne, New Jersey. But you know, those fanzines, in addition to the articles and the essays and the artwork and the other thing they also had ads in the back, people buying and selling their comic books. And I was trying to complete a couple of my collections, and there was an ad from this guy in Arlington who was selling a copy of Brave and Bold number 28. And that should have significance to those of you who are comic book fans. It was the first appearance of the Justice League of America. And I liked the Justice League, but I didn't have that issue. I didn't have the Brave and Bold. Brave and Bold, like Showcase, which was another magazine that DC did, these were tryout magazines that they would introduce a new hero or a new kind of comic strip and run 3 issues and see if the sales went up or down. And if they went up and it seemed promising, then that feature would get its own comic book. And that's how they tried out the Flash and the Green Lantern and the Atom, all of which were edited by Julie Schwartz, who the DC editor, who was really most responsible for the Silver Age, what we call the Silver Age versions of these old Golden Age heroes. It was interesting, though, to look at Justice League and Brave and Bold and Justice and Showcase, the two tryout magazines. I remember one run they had was comic books about firemen. That did not catch on and get its own book. But it is interesting to say, ooh, what if the fireman book had been big? Now we've entirely different conventions here of everybody dressed up like firemen and following their adventures. Anyway, I wanted Justice League number 28, and I sent away my money to this guy in Arlington, Texas. And it was a quarter. I was like in junior high, I didn't have a checking account. I'd never written a check in my life. Very few of us did. We used, to buy fanzines, we used what were called sticky quarters. We would have a index card, and we would tape the quarter to it with Scotch tape, which would make it sticky, and stick it in the mail, and then they would get it at the other end, and you'd have your sticky quarter. That's how we bought and sold that. So I sent away my sticky quarter, and I bought Justice League number 28. Howard crowed about that for years, about, yeah, I only paid a dime for that comic book, and you paid a quarter, I made a killing, yeah. Of course, I think it's worth like $50,000 today. So in the long run, I think I came out ahead on that. But when Howard sent me that comic book, he you put it in a manila envelope, but you didn't want it all to get crumpled and bent and all that, so you had to put in a stiffener, piece of cardboard or something like that. And Howard drew a barbarian on his stiffener because he was a storyteller and an artist. And I think it was supposed to be Conan, but he had a little letter. Hi, well, here's your comic. Do you like Conan? I like Conan. And somehow we started corresponding from that. And we had never met and would not meet for, that was 1963. That was before the first Comic-Con. John Kennedy was in the White House at the time, God help us, not for much longer. Yeah, it was a different era. So Howard and I started writing letters. We had no internet, of course. We couldn't text or send anything like that. We actually wrote letters, and it was a 3-cent stamp, and we'd get a letter to anyone in the country, and then, of course, they raised it to 4 cents. It was outrage. We were so pissed off. But we sent our letters back and forth, and I learned that Howard was like me, someone who dreamed of being a writer as well as a comic book fan. And he lived in Texas, where there were a number of other early comic fans, especially a trio of 3 close friends who called themselves the Texas Trio. Larry Herndon, Howard Keltner, and Buddy Saunders. And they had published their own fanzines. Fanzines were published either in most of them on mimeograph machines, which some of you may know what those are, or a process called Ditto, which involved trays of gelatin, and you typed on a master, and it came out purple for some reason. And you could make with you know how to do the Ditto, you could make, I don't know, 20, 30 copies of your fanzine, and each one fading a little. Howard Waldrop, who became my friend, introduced me to the Texas Trio, and I started getting some of their comic books. I started corresponding with a couple of the other members of the Texas Trio, and they launched, they had their dittoed fanzines, but they wanted to reach for the stars, so they put together a photo offset fanzine, which basically is printing or whatsoever, and it looked so much better. It was like printed, and they could get more than 20 copies out of it. And it was amateur superhero stories, which of course, you know, we all love superhero stories in those days. I certainly did. And Howard was a close friend of all of these, and he was the guy, he wasn't a member of the Texas Trio. I think to be a member of the Texas Trio, you actually had to, like, put in a little money. Howard had no money then, and later he had no money. And he was in college, and he got out of college, and he still had no money. I don't know how he survived until 2024, but he never had any money. He was the fourth member of the Texas Trio. And that was a really high quality fanzine at the time. And I was writing little amateur superhero stories and publishing them in other fanzines, less prestigious ones that were Ditto or something. My heroes, Garazan, the mechanical warrior, who was like an alien, who was a brain in a jar. But he had a whole wardrobe of mechanical robo bodies that he put it in. And what is the White Raider? I look back on these early things of mine, and I think I was going deranged even then. The White Raider was one of my first original superheroes. He was a superhero on skis, and it was the Cold War, so he was fighting the Russians. He would put on his skis from Norway, and he would ski over and attack Russian subs or something that were planning to start World War III or whatever. Of course, I was a kid who lived in the projects of Bayonne, New Jersey. I had never been on a set of skis in my life. I didn't know how to ski. I still don't know how to ski, and but nobody else was doing a superhero on skis, so I wanted to be that. So I did that, and I wrote this adventure, The White Raider, and he died at the end because I was already into killing people. How did I get that way? I don't know. But that was pretty popular. But meanwhile, the Texas Trio had launched their fanzine and Star Studded Comics, and they had created their own, you got the Marvel universe, and you get the DC universe, and back in those days, you also had the American Comics universe, and you had the Charlton universe. You had all these companies trying to get back into superheroes. So the Texas Trio created their own universe of characters that the three main guys had created, but then they invited other people to write adventures of those characters. So they didn't want my Garazan, they didn't want Garazan or the White Raider, they wanted to feature their own characters. So Howard Keltner, who was one of them, offered me the chance to write a story about Power Man, who was one of their main heroes. And I wrote one, except I couldn't, not only couldn't I ski, I could not draw, which was a drawback when you're doing comic books. But I could write stories in prose, and I don't know if any of you comic fans even remember the Silver Age comic books or before that, but they all had what we call text stories. Do you remember text stories? You would have a comic book, and it would have sometimes it would have two stories, a lead character and then a backup character who had a story in the back of the book. But between them, there would be one page, usually yellow, in which a very short story was published. And that was a text story. And I had no idea why comic books had text stories in them, except I was glad they did. I didn't like the text stories. They were usually not very good, but I could write text stories because I know how to write prose. It turned out later, I found out that the reason all comic books at that time had text stories is because that's how they got their second-class mailing permit, so they could mail out the comic books to subscribers. A comic book at those days was not considered art, so we couldn't get a pure comic book which just had comic book stories in it was not considered worthy of a mailing permit, so you had to have a text story. And Howard was also an artist. He had drawn that Conan thing. His art was much better than mine, but still not professional level, and not even the level of the comic book fanzines of the day. So he did some art. He did art for other people's stories too. He illustrated a lot of stories for the San Francisco-based group of writers out there who was doing other magazines. But again, neither one of us was ever going to be an artist. But we enjoyed writing these stories for that. And Howard and I published a number of stories in Star-Studded Comics, usually featuring Power Man, created by Howard Keltner, or a character called Dr. Weird, who was actually before Doctor Strange. We weren't copying Doctor Strange. He was before Doctor Strange. And it was an interesting concept. It was like a science fiction kind of idea. It was in the future, and it was a guy who was researching time travel. So he built his time machine, and then he went back in time to the early 60s, which is what it was, and he got out of his time machine just in time to interrupt a burglary, and the burglar shot him and killed him, like 5 seconds after that. And then a spirit appeared and said, "You have died before you were born. This cannot be. You must roam the earth as a ghost until the day, and it's like 100 years till we built a time machine." So Dr. Weird was bopping around and he was a ghost. So they assigned me to write Dr. Weird, and I did a couple of stories for that. The thing is, Howard, he did buy Brave and Bold number 28. He was a comic book fan too, but he was also Howard. He was unique. There was no one like Howard. I was writing Dr. Weird stories and Power Man stories, and occasionally for another fanzine, I was writing my own stories about GRRM or the White Raider or whoever the hell I was thinking of. All kind of superhero stories. Howard was writing that. What? Howard, this is like a Three Musketeers story. Well, that's what I felt like writing. Howard, this is historical fiction about the Roman legions. What the hell are you doing? Comic book fans don't want stories about the Roman legions. Well, they kind of did. Some of them did. And that was...
Hey, George.
That was Howard's story and my story, in a nutshell. So we continued to be friends and correspondents for a long, long time after that, and we both continued to publish in fanzines our stories, and my stories were, by and large, superhero stories, because I was that kind of comic fan. Howard's stories were about all kinds of fucking crazy stuff that nobody knew.
Hey, George.
Yes?
We love hearing you so incredibly much. We really want to see the films.
I haven't gotten to them yet.
I know, but we're running into overtime. So
Anyway, this is one of my uppity minions. In 1972, after we'd been correspondents and friends for 9 years, we'd never met. In 1972, I was in Chicago, Howard was still in Texas, and we decided we would meet in the flesh, and we would meet at a convention in Kansas City, Missouri. And I took the train down. Howard drove up with a bunch of his Texas friends, one of whom, Buddy Saunders of the Texas Trio. Buddy had a room in the hotel that we could stay at. Buddy had more money. Eventually, Buddy became the Buddy Sanders, and he opened a store, and then another store, and another store, and he had a whole chain of comic book stores and a big mail order business. Buddy became a major dealer. But even in those days, Buddy had more money than us, so he had a room, and Howard said, well, you can stay in Buddy's room. And Howard was staying in Buddy's room. He didn't have money. So I came down and said, well, I don't have money for a room, but I'll stay in Buddy's room. What Howard left out telling me is that 47 other Texans were also staying in Buddy's room. So Buddy had one of the beds, and the other bed was some friend of Buddy's, and the rest of us were all on the floor between the beds. There was a guy in the bathtub. There was a guy under the desk. I think I was the guy under the desk, come to think of it. Anyway, yes, I could talk for hours about that. Howard and I wrote an occasional story together, and we both had our careers. And you probably know a little about my career. We both sold our first professional sale early in the summer of 1970, and it appeared in 71. I sold a story called The Hero to Galaxy. Howard virtually simultaneously sold the story to Analog, edited by John W. Campbell Jr., one of the great idiosyncratic editors of science fiction and fantasy, the architect of the Golden Age. So Campbell bought Howard's story, Lunchbox, and then he died. So Howard always said, well, I killed John W. Campbell Jr. And maybe he did, but Ben Bova, who was his successor, published Howard's story, and we were both professional writers. And thereafter, years passed, and we both continued to do things. I wrote short stories that were not superhero, but they were science fiction stories and fantasy stories. Howard continued to write these weird-ass stories that nobody but Howard, I love the guy, but his imagination, Howard's stories were stories that nobody else would ever think of doing. And he didn't write any series. In fact, Howard had novel offers and novelizations. At one point they wanted him to write a Star Wars novel. He wasn't going to do a Star Wars novel. He was Howard. He was going to do weird-ass stories. So, and he wrote mostly short stories. In his career, Howard wrote a novel and a half. He wrote one with Buddy, a collaborative novel. And then he wrote a novel of his own that was really 3 stories linked together. And he had like 20 other novels that he partly wrote and he talked about for years, but never finished. And it still breaks my heart because I want to read his Red Mars story, and I want to read his story about I, John Mandeville. And I want to read all these novels that he was working on and never finished. But he finished a lot of short stories. A lot of short stories over the years. Now, if you know about the mechanics of the field, you can't make any money writing short stories, even in those days, and even novels didn't make much in those days. So Howard was always scraping by and living, he lived in Austin in later years, and that's a big college town. There were always college people looking for a roommate to move in, so Howard would move in with 3 other students and for a while, and then they would get in relationships or get a job or something or move out, and he would find other people to live with. And he did this for decades, and that's all. Well, I don't know how you young people do it these days, but back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of us who were like just out of college, we had these living arrangements where we're sharing a cheap apartment in a bad part of town with 4 friends. And it was a great way to live when you were 17, 18, 19, even 20. But Howard was still living that way in his 50s with a bunch of 17-year-olds because the other college students would get him. But in the meanwhile, he would write these stories. Anyway, Howard and I never lived in the same town. We would visit each other at these conventions and see each other, and we would write, and after a while we would phone. But Howard continued to write these stories. I think he probably wrote 100 during his lifetime and published them for, whatever money he could get, which usually wasn't very much. But people started noticing him. He started winning awards and losing more awards, and then occasionally winning awards. He a few years before he died, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the World Fantasy Convention as one of the great lifetime achievements for a fantasy writer. But his fantasy was a lot different than like my fantasy or Tolkien's fantasy or anybody else's fantasy. And he also won an award early in his career for a story called The Ugly Chickens, which you're going to see. So a few years before Howard died, he was living in an assisted living facility in Austin, still writing stories, still trying to finish some of the novels. And I decided to make some films based on some of his short stories. It was a way to get some money to Howard and also to get his stories out there to hopefully people who would love them as much as I did. Now, if you're looking for a Game of Thrones kind of thing, or a Tolkien kind of thing, or you're looking for romantasy, or whatever the hell, you're not going to find it in Howard Waldrop. What you're going to find in Howard Waldrop is stories that nobody else could tell. And we made 3 of these movies, and Howard did see all 3, at least in rough form, before he died. And to my, it really thrilled me that he liked them. That was very important to me. He saw a rough cut of one of them just 6 days before he died. And he liked it, so that was great. So what are these 3 stories? Well, one of his earliest stories was called Mary Margaret Road Grader, and this is sort of a post-Holocaust story with an entirely American Indian cast, and it's about civilization has collapsed, but people are still having tractor pulls, and that's what it's about. It's sort of a feminist tractor pull story. And it got a lot of attention for Howard and was nominated for some awards, which it lost. Then he also wrote probably his most famous story, The Ugly Chickens, which you're about to see. And it's, how do I describe The Ugly Chicken? Well, it's about the dodo bird. So I almost got this made when in my earliest TV things I was on Twilight Zone, and we were adapting stories, short stories for episodes of Twilight Zone. So I pitched CBS and the Twilight Zone people, and let's do an adaptation of The Ugly Chickens. And the Twilight Zone writers and all that, we loved the idea, until it reached the execs at CBS, and they said, "Who the fuck gives a damn about dodo birds?" So that was, that didn't get made, but that's fine because we did a better job here anyway. So there's that one. And that one was nominated for the Hugo and the Nebula and the World Fantasy Award. And it won the World Fantasy Award and it won the Nebula, but it did not sadly win a Hugo. Howard lost a lot of Hugos, never won one. But it's a fabulous story. And then the other one, some of you probably know about War of the Worlds. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. The Martians, here come the Martians, they're invading Earth, and there's a line in War of the Worlds where Wells mentions 10 explosions being seen on the surface of Mars as the Martians, with their giant cannons, lost their spaceships to come invade it. Howard is the only one who kind of then went through War of the Worlds and said, but there's only 8 cylinders land on Mars. Where'd the other 2 go to? Oh, Texas. So he wrote Night of the Cooters, which is the 3rd of the stories that we adapted, and that was a wonderful story too. It was nominated for awards, didn't win any, but it did it. So we put together these 3 films, and nobody shows, these are short films, they're about 30 minutes each. Nobody distributes short films. Short films get nominated for Oscars, but you don't play at the local movie theater. So they are what they are, but you can enter them in film festivals. So that's what we've been doing. We made these short films. We've been entering them in film festivals. We've won a number of prizes from various film festivals for these films, and I hope you'll like them too. And it's our hope, if we can get a distribution deal, to put these on a streamer, maybe to even launch a TV series about, Tales of Howard Waldrop or whatever. Because like I said, he had 100 other stories here. He has, God, I can't even tell you about it. some of the stories about Howard's stories that only Howard could write them. Nobody else would ever have the crazy imagination or to write these stories. So we're going to present them to you. There's 3 of them here, the 3 that we finished. There's a 4th one that's actually in post-production right now, but we don't have it ready to go. But we have the Ugly Chickens, Mary Margaret Road Grader, Night of the Cooters. They have nothing to do with each other. They have nothing to do with me, except I was the producer on it. But we got a top team. We got Vincent D'Onofrio, directed and starred in one of them. Felicia Day. We gave the lead to the Ugly Chickens in that, and Mary Margaret Road Grader. Those of you who have seen Dark Winds, the Tony Hillerman thing we do. There's some of the actors from that in this. It's pretty much all American Indian cast. The screenplay it was by Stephen Paul Judd, a very rising Oklahoma Native American screenwriter, director, and everything else. So yeah, I could talk for a long time, but as my impatient minion wants.
I am the impatient minion.
You want to see you probably want to see
Enough-ity.
the movies, and yes, I will leave you in Howard's ample hands and the rest of the people. I hope you all love these as much as I do. And,